Hail, adventurers! Step in. Welcome to Doom Swords. I invite you to rest your weary bodies and minds and gather around the hearth as I continue the tale of combat in advanced Dungeons and Dragons on this episode of Doom's Words. All right, everybody. Welcome to part 2 on this series, or in this series. Let's talk combat. Thanks for tuning in. When I'm talking about combat here, I'm specifically talking about combat in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and trying to break it down into manageable pieces that are accurate, correct, easy to understand, and then hopefully somewhat entertaining. In giving it some thought on how I intended to approach the making of this video series and where I want to take it and how to get there, I felt that it was important to draft up a document of concepts and definitions related to Advanced Dungeons and Dragons combat. Certainly some of these are things that are going to be basic and remedial to a lot of people. And yeah, it's just some dude reading a document to some other people. So maybe on the surface, that's might not be very entertaining. It might actually be boring, but I think with interjecting some commentary into this and pointing out some things that people might not think about when they think about these underlying things, I hope it can be more entertaining than just watching some guy read some stuff to some people, right? These concepts and definitions, I think, are important to understand when laying a foundation for talking about Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and also sort of serving as a framework to kind of limit the discussion to the things specifically that we're going to be talking about. So let's get started. Raw. Okay. Raw simply refers to the rules as written. Raw in AD&D usually applies to the first 3 core rule books, right? That would be the MM, PHB, and DMG. In their full title, known as the Monster Manual, Player's Handbook, and Dungeon Master's Guide. While I was putting this together, I actually found it kind of interesting. I sort of had an epiphany that occurred to me, and it might have occurred to me in the past as well. But one of the major contributions of AD&D in general is just the titling of those 3 core books. When we look at any edition of Dungeons and Dragons, they came after, excluding basic Dungeons and Dragons, but including 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons, 4th edition, 5th edition, 5.5, or whatever we're calling that. All of those use similar titling for their main core rule books. They all have a monster manual, they all have a player's handbook, and they all have a dungeon master's guide. Now, when talking about Raw, some people include Unearthed Arcana as well. But the first 3 books are usually the focus when determining how the Raw work. Unearthed Arcana adds some things, and but their impact on the core combat mechanics can generally be boiled down into things that you don't necessarily need to use for your game in order for them to make really a big difference on combat itself, or said another way, they're largely inconsequential. If you use Unearthed Arcana, that's great. If you don't, that's great too. It's not really going to affect the core combat mechanics. At least for this series, I'm ignoring Unearthed Arcana. We'll certainly talk about it at points, and we'll come across other materials that reference those rules when we look at later on down the road when we look at how people run combat and how combat has been codified by various different DMs, some of which who use Unearthed Arcana in forming the basis for how they run combat and initiative and encounters and stuff, and some people who don't. Okay. Regardless, when we're talking about Raw, of the three core rule books, we're primarily dealing with the Player's Handbook and the Dungeon Master's Guide, as those are the volumes that have most of the information. Monster Manual does have some core combat mechanics and some suggestions and things like that, but for the most part, it came out before the other books, so a lot of the stuff that's been put in there was descriptive stuff or specific combat capabilities of individual creatures, and it was published really before a lot of ideas had been formulated in the Player's Handbook, and then further in the DMG. So there's not a lot we have to look at in the Monster Manual for this particular series. The Player's Handbook and the DMG are sufficient. One of the first definitions that we need to talk about is armor class. Okay, armor class is a number that represents how well protected a combatant is while engaged in combat. In the case of armor-wearing creatures, the armor itself provides the protection. The base AC value assigned to a specific armor doesn't change regardless of who or what is wearing that armor. Okay, it's assumed that all creatures will be equally proficient in the use of whatever armor they choose to wear. So if your character class or whatever, or in the case of monsters, some monsters will wear armor, particularly if it's an improvement over their base armor class. It's assumed that you're proficient in that, and there's no additional proficiency or specialization that makes you better at using it. It's just part of your training. If your character class can use it, you're equally proficient in the use of your armor, say as a thief, as you are in your choice of armor as a fighter. Okay. For creatures that don't wear armor, that would be a lot of monsters, even some humanoid monsters. AC is given a value that represents a combination of factors. That includes the toughness of a creature's hide, general reflexes, agility, creature's ability to dodge and deflect attacks, and plenty more that I haven't mentioned here. Right? Pretty much anything you can think of and bring in to sort of the creature's innate abilities can represent armor class if they're related to defense. Armor class is measured in a descending manner with a range of 10, which would be the worst possible, to negative 10, which would be the best possible. Now, armor class, particularly in the case of characters, right? Armor class may be adjusted by dexterity, regardless of the armor type worn. There's no penalty for, say, wearing plate mail. You only get a maximum dexterity adjustment versus a guy who's wearing leather. It's pointed out specifically, I think, in the DMG page 28. It's pointed out that limiting dexterity adjustment based on the type of armor character wears would, in its totality, be a mistake, and justification is given, as it often is. Armor can also be modified by the use of a shield, which will improve your armor class by 1 point. But that's only based against a certain number of attacks per round based upon the size of the shield. So, for example, a small shield is only good for improving your armor class for 1 attack against you during a combat round. So if you're fighting 3 guys who have a small shield, you get that additional point of armor class against one of those attacks, but not against the others. And this is something that's that I find often to be ignored, but it's an interesting dynamic, and it represents sort of a strategic choice that the player may make when equipping their characters. And the more strategic choices we have within the game system, I think the better the game system runs, and the more fun everybody has. Okay, it takes it away from being just a one-dimensional affair, and actually gives it breadth and a bigger scope when armor, shields, and weapons all have meaningful choices that change strategy and mechanics of combat and exploration situations, or anything else that they affect. Um, Combat circumstances will definitely, there's several of them that will both um, modify your armor class, penalties and bonuses, and there are magical effects that can be applied as well. So moving on, hit points, also known as HP, are representative of the amount of damage a creature can withstand before being considered incapacitated and or dead. While hit points do partially represent the ability to withstand physical damage, they also represent an abstraction of such things as combat ability, agility, general skill, divine favor. If you're running in a fantasy campaign settings where um, gods play a large part in the affairs of mortals, and AD&D sort of limits it, or not limits. AD&D sort of makes itself naturally available. I can't think of the word that I'm looking for, but in AD&D, that's often the case, right? The alignment system and the cosmic struggle all make it clear that most of the fantasy campaign settings that you're going to be playing the game in are heavily dependent upon gods shaping the affairs of the world, or at least involving themselves in the affairs of the world, whether they walk amongst men or not. The blind luck figures into hit points. There's a whole lot of things. It's really just an abstraction. Okay, that's what hit points are. A lot of people, when they look at hit points, might think, hit points are specifically the ability to withstand physical punishment, but that's not really the case. If you look at them that way, then on the surface, they're going to be considered silly for the most part, because that will fall apart. There's no way that a normal, for the most part, human being who's a highly trained soldier or whatever and has 50 hit points is going to means that he's capable of suffering 5 or 10 stabs from a short sword, any one of which would kill another person. Okay, so try to think of it as an abstraction rather than representation of how tough an individual is, right? When a PC's hit points reach 0 or a negative number, he's subject to being unconscious, dying, or dead. Rules exist for this in AD&D, and there are optional rules that the DM may use to kind of determine when that happens. And those are spelled out pretty well in the Dungeon Master's Guide. And like most things in the Dungeon Master's Guide, things that are core fundamentals of combat, if there's a good opportunity to modify those, at least according to Gygax, if there's a good opportunity to modify those, usually he'll present you with an option. Okay, while AD&D is largely considered to be something that the DM takes control over. He's the final arbiter on everything that happens in his campaign. Combat is one of those areas that's considered important enough that people should think very carefully before they make any changes to certain systems, because they'll statistically have an effect on how things turn out over time. With other creatures, NPCs, unimportant NPCs at least, and monsters, it's generally assumed that when their hit points reach 0 or lower, they're just considered dead, unless otherwise adjudicated by the DM or specified in the details of a creature. There are a number of creatures within the monster manual where just because they hit 0 hit points, that doesn't necessarily mean they're dead, right? Trolls will hit 0 hit points and regenerate. Take, for example, something like the Water Weird. It reaches 0 hit points and it's not truly dead. It's just dissipated and waiting to reform. Okay, so there are those situations. Excuse me, those situations to be aware of. Moving on, we go to dexterity, reaction, and attacking adjustments. This adjustment, if any, comes from the dexterity score of combatants with ability scores. That is, it's generally applicable only to PCs and classed NPCs, right? It affects attack rolls when using ranged weapons, and a bonus also affects surprise when the combatant is not encumbered, as well as initiative when the combatant is both unencumbered and using a ranged weapon. So that's an important distinction. In order for it to apply in either case, the creature must be unencumbered. In order for it to apply to initiative, he must be unencumbered and using a ranged weapon, right? So a dexterity reaction attacking adjustment doesn't give you any bonus to hit if you're stabbing away at somebody with the aforementioned short sword. Now, regardless of encumbrance, any reaction adjustment penalties are always applied to surprise and initiative. Okay, so if you have a particularly low dexterity and you can be considered clumsy or whatever else a low dexterity would entail, that's going to always be applied, regardless of whether you're carrying nothing or carrying something, which I think makes sense. And now, the reason that this is generally applicable to PCs and classed NPCs is because monsters in AD&D don't have, for the most part, don't have ability scores. And generally speaking, even if they did have ability scores, those ability scores would be sort of subsumed into the remainder of the stats of the creature, right? I know in later editions, ability scores would be assigned where they were important. Sometimes the rest of them would be 10 across the board or whatever the case is, but AD&D doesn't focus on ability scores for monsters. You will find some monsters that have ability scores, primarily strength and intelligence. All monsters are assigned with a term for the level of intelligence they have that roughly corresponds to a character's intelligence score. So, attack rolls. While there are many potential attacks during the course of a combat round, very few of these potential attacks have any real chance of success. Most of them will be blocked, dodged, poorly executed, or affected by some other circumstance that renders them entirely ineffectual. Those attacks that do have a chance of success are designated as attack rolls and must be rolled with 1d20 by the attacker. Okay, if the value of the attack roll in any combat modifiers meets or exceeds the value necessary to hit the attacked creature's armor class, the damage that the attack causes will generally be diced for. The number necessary to hit the armor class in question can be found in the attack matrix for the class performing the attack roll. Okay, there's tables for the various classes. We refer to that as the attack matrix. You cross-reference the armor class of the creature and your modified attack roll to arrive at a determination of whether or not your attack has been successful. Any strength bonus in the case of melee attacks or dexterity bonus in the case of ranged and missile attacks modifies the attack roll. Additionally, there can be situational modifiers that happen during combat or magical modifiers to attack rolls based on circumstances that take place during the combat round. It's important to say a word about critical hits and fumbles in the system. A roll of 20 after including all modifiers allows a combatant to hit whatever armor class a roll of 20 normally hits, while also allowing that combatant to hit any armor class of up to 5 armor classes better. Okay, so as an example, if a combatant hits armor class 0 on a modified attack roll of 20, he also hits up to armor class -5 on a modified attack roll of 20. Outside of this consideration, critical hits don't exist in AD&D. Now, there is an option presented in the rules to force the above scenario that we talk about, hitting 5 armor classes better, to occur only on unmodified rolls of 20. So not modified rolls, but natural 20s as well. And that's one of those things we talked about earlier, where if Gygax or somebody else felt while compiling the Dungeon Master's Guide that it made sense to make something optional, they would usually give you guidelines on how to modify that so as not to change the way that combat plays out or change the statistics that go into combat in a way that affects things negatively. Attack rolls of 1 are not automatic misses in AD&D. There may be cases where an attack roll of 1 is sufficient to hit your opponent's armor class. There exists no fumble rule that takes that away. I know a lot of other systems, there's a fumble. Oh, you roll the 1. Okay, well, you drop your sword, it sticks through your foot or something. That would be an absurd example, but everybody's seen it happen at the table, and you might get a good chuckle out of it and a laugh, but AD&D doesn't really work that way. And the way fumbles are used in those types of games would require critical hits to be used as well. And if you start using critical hits, you should probably start talking about hit locations and all these other sort of hardcore simulationist things. AD&D doesn't try to do that, and it's actively discouraged within the text. And Gygax felt strongly that neither of those things would be beneficial to the game, and he gives reasons for those, which is why I encourage everybody to fully read the text of at least the player's handbook. And then DMs obviously should fully read the text of the Dungeon Master's Guide, because not only are these concepts and definitions given more depth and discussion in those texts, they're also explained in a way that makes them a little bit easier to understand. I think that's good for now. In the next part of the combat and definitions portion of this series, we're going to move on to attack routines. I imagine one more session of this will get us through the remainder of this document and give us a good solid foundation for where we'll go to next. The goal is going to be to try to keep these short and try to post them as often as I possibly can. Anyway, thanks for hanging out. Appreciate it. Have a great day.